40 to 45. And the title is The Cleansing of the Leper. And I'm going to be reading from the Modern English Version. A leper came to him, pleading with him, and kneeling before him, saying, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, extended his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." As soon as he had spoken, the leprosy immediately left, and he was cleansed. He sternly warned him and sent him away at once, saying, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to proclaim it widely and spread the news around, so that Jesus could no more openly enter the city, but was out in remote places, and they came to him from everywhere.
And welcome home to Kat. Yeah, she's like been traveling the world, but she always finds her way back. So that's good. You're always welcome here. Okay, I had no clue that this story was part of the Sabbath school lesson when I wrote it 2 weeks ago, and it's just a God thing. And we love it when there's God things. So that's pretty cool. Okay, Joseph Damien de Veuster was born in Tremello, Belgium on January 3, 1840. At age 23, young Damien set sail for the Hawaiian Islands, eager to share the gospel with the people of this land so far across the sea, actually 2 seas. After a voyage that nearly lasted half a year, that's pretty amazing, half a year, he arrived in Honolulu and eventually began serving on Maui. During Damien's time there, an influx of British and American merchants brought new difficulties to the native Hawaiians. With no resistance to the European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis, their population shrank, and this figure just blew my mind, from 300,000 to 50,000. Okay, so that is 4 out of 5. 5 out of 6 Hawaiians died. So can you imagine how they were feeling at that point? When an epidemic of leprosy broke out, the government leaders on the island sent the infected to live in quarantine on the island of Molokai, earning it the moniker Devil's Island. It's where you went to die. Many families wanted to keep their sick home to care for them, but medical inspectors and armed officials were sent to forcibly remove the ill who would not cooperate and leave. Damien pleaded with the local authorities, but no budging. Heartbroken now by the tragedy that had ripped the families apart, Damien decided that he would go to Molokai to care for those lepers, understanding that he could never come back. Getting to the island was a terrifying experience. Boat crews were so afraid of the lepers on the island and the disease that they would not take the ships to dock. So they had these poor lepers, already sick, jump out of the boat and swim the remaining distance through the roaring waves. Once ashore, Molokai was anarchic. The stronger lepers preyed on the weak. Lawlessness was rampant, and it was not a fun place to live. In 1873, when Damien arrived on Molokai, there were 800 lepers on the island. And the first thing he had to do was bring order to the chaos. He provided critical infrastructure and spiritual encouragement. He preached every week. He arranged lots of funerals and burials. He encouraged the islanders to grow their gardens so they could have good nutrition. He built huts and he built a church. He even engineered an irrigation system so everyone on the island could have clean water. While the doctors would deliver medicine, none were brave enough to actually come ashore. They did not want any contact because this was a communicable disease. Damien, however, went from hut to hut and cared for the sick himself. He dressed their wounds, and he said this, "If I cannot cure them as our Savior did, at least I can comfort them." Amen. Thanks to Damien, the island was transformed into an ordered community. Okay, they made him a saint. I think I agree. I think he definitely was a saint. In 1885, Damien began to develop leprosy himself. It was inevitable. He discovered it when he was taking a bath and accidentally poured scalding water on his feet. He didn't feel it. But then his feet began to blister, and he realized he was now an insider to this disease. The story of his incredible selflessness quickly spread around the world, and it made him a celebrity. But some still said he must be doing it for the money. Can you imagine? I mean, what would you do with money if you were stranded on Molokai with leprosy? Damien remained steadfast and gracious, and he was known to hobble as he lost a foot and then a leg up to a knee, still around the island caring for the other people. He served until his death in 1889. He was 44 years old. Okay, so leprosy is nothing to laugh at. It's a horrible, horrible disease. It was widespread in Palestine and was one of the most dreaded diseases in the ancient world. It was the subject of tremendous fear and superstition. The term leprosy means to scale or peel, the same word as the scales of a fish, which is kind of interesting. It was a skin disease that was difficult to diagnose and impossible to heal. The Hebrew term related to a whole variety of skin diseases, including boils, burns, itches, ringworm, and scalp conditions. Scribes counted up to 72 different skin disorders, all under the umbrella of leprosy. In the Old Testament, leprosy was considered an outward sign of inward defilement. So if you had leprosy, you were known in the minds of everyone else that you were a sinner. To safeguard the rest of the community, the lepers were to make themselves look as undesirable as possible. They were not to comb their hair, leave their hair uncombed, you see there in the Leviticus verse, and cover their mouth, thinking that it was spread by breath, and call out, "Unclean, unclean." They also put bells around their necks so you could hear them coming. All right, because you did not want to be anywhere around a leper. The closest a leper could be to someone else that didn't have the disease was 6 feet. Does that sound familiar? Okay? One rabbi reportedly bragged that he would not even buy his groceries if a leper had been there in several days. Okay? Just thinking it was that contagious. Another rabbi boasted that he always threw rocks at lepers to make sure they stayed far away. Just imagine hearing that priest pronounce you as unclean, and then hearing the pronouncement, you will remain unclean, and you must live in isolation in your place outside of the camp. So they created leper colonies, and they had to live alone. No wonder that there was few words as terrifying to the Jewish people than the word leprosy. So I'm going to tell you this story, and the original was Max Lucado, but I have altered it drastically. So if you like it, it was Max Lucado, and if you don't, that was me. Okay, whatever part of it, all right? And vice versa, whatever. But it doesn't look like the original story, but I based, I started there. And it's in the first person. So it's from a leper named Ezra. So consider what this was like from his point of view. For 5 years, no one has touched me. Not my wife, not my child, not my friends. They saw me, and they stood 6 feet back, and they would speak loudly so I could hear. I sensed the love in their voices. I saw concern in their eyes, but I never felt their touch. Not once. What was common to you, I coveted. A handshake, a warm embrace, a tap on the shoulder to get my attention, a kiss on the lips. These moments were taken from my world. No one touched me. They didn't even bump into me. And sometimes I just dreamt of having someone bump into me, as if they were unaware that I had leprosy. But for 5 years, it has not happened. And how could it? I was not allowed on the street. Even the rabbis kept their distance from me. I could not go to the synagogue. And can you imagine being banished from church and not ever being able to come on Sabbath to worship? I was not welcome in my own home. I was untouchable. I was a leper. One year during harvest, my grip on my scythe seemed to weaken. The tips of my fingers went numb. First one finger, then the other. Within a short time, I could just grip the tool, but I couldn't feel it. By the end of the season, I felt nothing at all. The hand grasping the handle might have belonged to someone else, for all I knew. The feeling was gone. I said nothing to my wife, but I knew she was watching me like something was wrong. How could she not notice? I began to carry my hand against my body like a wounded bird. One afternoon, I plunged my hands into a basin of water, intending to wash my face, and the water turned red. My finger was bleeding. It was bleeding a lot, profusely. I didn't even know I was wounded. How had I cut myself? On a knife? Had I slipped my hand against the sharp edge of my scythe? I must have, but I hadn't felt anything. It's on your clothes, too, my wife said. She was behind me. Before looking at her, I looked down at the blood that was all down my robe. For the longest time, I stood over the basin, staring at my bleeding finger, and I knew my life now would be forever altered. Shall I go with you? She asked. No, I sighed. I'll go to see the priest alone. I turned and looked into her moist eyes filled with tears. Standing next to her was my 3-year-old daughter. Squatting I looked into her eyes and stroked her cheek with my good hand. What could I say? I stood and looked again at my wife. She didn't hug me. She touched my shoulder and I touched hers. That would be our final touch. 5 years have passed and no one has touched me since, until today. The priest didn't touch me when he declared me unclean. He looked at my hand, now wrapped in a rag. He looked at my face, sadder than sorrow. I've never faulted him for what he said. He covered his mouth and extended a hand, palm forward, as if to say, "Get away from me. You are unclean." With that one pronouncement, I lost my family, my farm, my future, and my friends. My wife met me at the city gates with a sack of clothing, bread, and some coins. She didn't speak. By now, friends had gathered. What I saw in their eyes was a precursor from what I would always see in other people's eyes: fearful pity. As I stepped out, they stepped back. The horror that they felt as they saw me overtook their concern for me. Oh, how repulsed those who saw me. 5 years of leprosy left my hands gnarled and several fingers missing. The tips of my fingers were gone, as were portions of an ear and my nose. They say the rats would eat lepers, and they wouldn't feel it, so they couldn't even wake up and put them away. At the sight of me, fathers grabbed their children and mothers covered their eyes. Children pointed and stared. The rags on my body could never hide all my sores. No, could the wrap on my face hide the rage in my eyes. How many nights had I shaken my crippled fists at the silent sky? What did I do to deserve this? But never a reply. I was unclean, maybe to God too. So I grew tired of it all, sleeping in the colonies, smelling the stench, so sick of the bell around my neck. As if I needed it, one glance and people began yelling, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," and they would scurry like rats. Several weeks ago, I dared walk down the road to my village. I had no intention to actually enter town, heaven knows. I only wanted to look at my fields and gaze again at my home to see how the crops were growing and perhaps catch a glimpse of my wife. I did not see her, but I saw some children playing in my pasture. I hid behind the tree and I watched them scamper away. Their faces were so joyful and their laughter contagious. And for just a moment, I felt like I wasn't a leper. I was a man. I was a father. Infused with their happiness, I stepped out from behind the tree. I straightened my back and I breathed deeply. Then they saw me. Before I could retreat, they screamed and scattered. One lingered, though, behind the others. One paused and looked at my direction. She was about the age that my daughter would be. And I wondered, is this my little girl now, 5 years later? Then one day my wife came and told me there was news in our town. There was a man named Jesus who was teaching in the synagogues and along the mountainsides. She told me that in the synagogue she heard him say something amazing. This is what he said. "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Ezra said, "Ezra," she pleaded, "he's healing people. He can heal anybody of anything. He says that he's humble and gentle, which is not the way the rabbis are. Humble and gentle. He invites people to come to him. And it's hard to believe, Ezra, but someone else heard him say this: all that the Father draws will come to me, and whoever comes, I will never, ever send away. That's what Ezra's wife heard Jesus say. See if you can find him, Ezra. Maybe he can give you your life back. And here's the good news. Jesus can always give you your life back if you come to him. That is what made me take the steps I took today. Of course it was reckless. Of course it was risky. It was against the law. They could stone me for entering a crowd, for going to where Jesus was. I guess, though, if he said, come to me if you have a heavy burden, that means me. I qualify. Do any of the rest of you qualify for carrying a heavy burden? Either he will kill me for breaking the Levitical law, or he will hear my desperation and heal me. He promised he would never, ever send anyone away. So I wondered. People said God had brought this sickness, this calamity to my body, that I was under a judgment for my sin. I guess I'll go find him and find out. But then I saw him. I cannot find the words to describe what he saw. Before he spoke, I knew he cared. Somehow I knew he hated this disease of mine as much, no, even more than I did. And my despair became trust, and my anger became hope. From behind a rock, I watched him walk down the hill, surrounded by a crowd of people. I waited until he was just where I could intersect his path, and I stepped into the crowd. Can you imagine the courage that would take? Master, Master, he said. He stopped and he looked in my direction, as did dozens of others. A flood of fear swept across the crowd, and they again ran. Unclean, they shouted. I don't blame them. But his compassion I had never seen before. Everyone else ran away, and he stepped toward me. Toward me. Years ago, my wife had stepped toward me. She was the last person to do that. Now he did. And I knelt at his feet, my faith rising up in my heart. Lord, you can heal me if you are willing. Had he healed with a word, I would have been thrilled. Had he cured me with a prayer, I would have rejoiced. Later, I would hear stories that he could heal somebody in the town one over if they had faith, and he set his attention and his healing power upon them. But he was not satisfied with speaking to me. He drew near me and he touched me. Amen. So the Greek word for touch in this verse is fascinating. It's hapto, and it means to fasten to, adhere to. So Jesus did not touch this leper with one finger out, still trying to stand away as far as possible, like the way I touch the slugs I collect every night. This word is used to describe the way couples who are married hug each other. Now, why our English translations don't put that in there, I don't know. But that's what the Greek word that's in this text means, to fastened to adhere to. So the picture on your bulletin of the man who is kneeling and Jesus bending over to hug him probably depicts what happened in this story. All right. Jesus is not disgusted by our sin, our disease, or our weakness. Instead, his compassion draws us to him when we are the most helpless. When you need him most and you ask him for help, he says, I will. And then he hugs us. Ask him for help. Energy flooded my body like water through a furrowed field. In an instant, I felt warmth where there'd been numbness, strength where there'd been atrophy. My back straightened and my head lifted. Where I had been eye level with his belt, he lifted me up, and I could stand before him. He cupped my hands on my cheeks, and he drew me so near that I could feel the warmth of his breath and see the tears in his eyes too. He smiled. And then he said something really strange to me. He said, go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for the people to be made well. And he said, this will show people what I have done. Now, in Sabbath school, we got to this story. I don't know if you did downstairs. But the fact that he told this man to go to the priest was to be a witness also to the priest. So Jesus was having compassion not only on the leper, but on the priests, which is pretty cool. Compassion has ripple effects. It goes a long way. All right? So that's where I'm going. I will show myself to the priest, and when he says I'm clean, I will hug him. I will show myself to my wife, and then I will hug her. And then I'll pick up my daughter, and I'll swing her around and around and around as many times as we both can stand it. And then I will hug her, and I will not let go. She's older now, but I will do that. And every time I give or receive a hug, I will never forget the Savior who hugged me. He could have healed me with a word, but he wanted to do more than heal me. He wanted me to know that he loved me. He wanted me to know that he was a God who loved lepers and the marginalized and the outcasts of every kind. Imagine that. The men would run away yelling unclean, but Jesus stepped forward and hugged me. What kind of a God would walk toward a leper full of rotting flesh and putrefying sores and hug them? But after Ezra went home and he hugged his wife and he swung his daughter around, he decided that Jesus telling him not to tell anybody, that wasn't such a good idea. How can you keep this kind of good news inside? So he went back to the leper colony and told all of his friends from there the good news about Jesus. How he says, no one who comes to me will I ever, ever drive away. He figured that would be the kind thing to do. Oh, really? It didn't make sense to him that Jesus had told him not to. And so many times we think we know better than Jesus. And we do what comes naturally rather than what he said. So all the lepers came to Jesus. And so did everyone else. The crowds grew huge and unwieldy. And there was no longer opportunity for smaller, more intimate teaching. And there was no longer opportunity to go even into the synagogue because the crowd was so great and it was so full of lepers. In an interesting plot twist, Ezra gets to go home in the town to his family and live in community. But what does the word say Jesus is forced to do? He had to stay out in the secluded places. The leper and Jesus traded places. Jesus had to stay out in the secluded places, and people from everywhere came out of the towns to see him. Okay, so Jesus knew that if he hugged this leper and healed this leper, this would happen. So why did he do it? Compassion. The same reason he turned the water into wine for his mother. His time was not yet. He wasn't ready in the timetable to have a confrontation with the priests. He wasn't ready for these size of crowds. He wanted still to train his disciples a little more thoroughly. But the same reason, that compassion, once he was face to face with Ezra the leper, how could he help himself? He went against his own better judgment. Because love trumps all. And that's the heart of the Savior that I serve. So I've been reading an excellent little book. It's called Gentle and Lowly, and it's by Dane Ortland. And the interesting thing is, about 40 years ago, I read a book by his mother entitled Open Heart, Open Home, about Christian hospitality. And now this is their son, who is a professor of New Testament theology. And the subtitle of this book is The Heart of Christ for Sinners and Sufferers. Okay, who qualifies? We all sin and we all suffer. Is that true? And so I included a quotation from this book at the front of the bulletin, because I want you, if you're interested, to be able to have that reference and be able to order it for yourself. About $10 on Amazon. Okay, because I think we all need to understand the heart of God. I think the way people portray God is just plain not true. And if we understood the heart of God, it would be easy to trust him and easy to follow him. So I want to just go through this quotation that I copied in the bulletin so you can even look at it as we go. The Greek word for compassion refers most literally to the bowels or guts of a person. So it's this gut-driven feeling. And it can be a positive or a negative feeling, but it's where you just cannot hold it inside. Okay? It's an ancient way of referring to what rises up from one's innermost core. This compassion reflects the deepest heart of Christ. He is the most understanding person in the universe. No one in human history has been more approachable than Jesus Christ. Isn't that good news? The posture most natural to him is not a pointed finger, but open arms. The minimum bar to be enfolded in the embrace of Jesus is simple. Come to him. Open yourself up to him. That's all he needs. He'll take it from there. Indeed, that is the only thing he can work with. Your very burden is what qualifies you to come. You don't have to clean yourself up first. When you come to Christ for mercy and love and help in your anguish and perplexity and sinfulness, you are going with the flow of his deepest wishes, not against them. Jesus, now this is what I just think is so amazing. Jesus gets more joy and comfort than we do when we come to him for help and mercy. So you want to make God's day? Just come to him. Just show up at his feet and say, I need help, and he will know what to do. He will prompt you on how to pray. He'll help you figure out what the next step needs to be. And he will always, always, always forgive you. That was in our Sabbath school lesson. I don't know if you got that downstairs. But that it's always God's will to forgive you. So if you need that, just come. He will not drive you away. Is that good news or what? It's amazing news. So, let's skip the next one. When Jesus described what his heart was like, the only place in all of his teachings where he said, this is my heart, he described it as humble and gentle. Humble and gentle. That is the heart. He says, let me teach you, because I'm humble and gentle of heart. You don't have to worry that I'm going to get heavy-handed and judgmental with you. Just come and let me teach you. And then Dane goes to great lengths to describe what this means. But basically it means, you are always welcome. My arms are always open. And then Dane quotes Thomas Goodwin, who wrote in the 16th century, Christ's own comfort, happiness, and glory are increased and enlarged by his showing grace and mercy in pardoning, relieving, and comforting his members on earth. Well, that sounds kind of like our song we sang for opener, Jesus, what a friend for sinners. And then Goodwin says this, Christ gets more joy and comfort than we do when we come to him for help and mercy. So you want to make God's day? What do you need to do? Just come to him. Just show up. Real, raw, whatever's going wrong, just come to him. Show up, and he'll know what to do. Ah, that's so good. So I want to finish by returning to the story of Father Damien. In showing the act of compassion, he caught the disease of the people he was trying to help. People thought he was crazy on a suicide mission. And it might seem that when Jesus healed the leper, he was so spotlessly pure and holy that it was his cleanness that was contagious, not the leprosy. That was in the Desire of Ages passage that Glenn read in Sabbath school. His cleanness was stronger than the leper's contagiousness. All right? Jesus did not catch leprosy. Instead, Ezra caught a new life. But his compassion, the compassion of Jesus, didn't seem to cost as much as Father Damien's. He didn't catch it. But the healing of people's bodies was not the end of the story. It was God's heart of compassion. Oh, I need to be back on, please. It was his heart of compassion that moved him to give his only son to a broken, ruined world. It was our only hope, and God made an intentional choice to choose us, even knowing what that plan would cost Jesus. Now here's the mind-boggling truth. God loved us as much as he loved his perfect, adorable son. He chose us over just bringing his son home. Why, we will never know. It is a mystery beyond human comprehension. Except that God's heart was full of compassion. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so this Jesus that hugged lepers is the same as the Father who also would hug lepers if he walked on planet Earth. Jesus did not catch leprosy, and he didn't catch our sinfulness. It said he was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. He did not catch our sinfulness, and that's good news, isn't it? It's amazing, too. Instead, when he faced his death on the cross, he willingly took it upon himself. He took our sin and bore it. And Isaiah 53, and I didn't write the text in, but it's from Isaiah 53. It says this, surely he took on our infirmities. It would be up here. Our physical infirmities, our emotional infirmities, our spiritual infirmities. And we all have a few. In all of those categories, right? The whole ball of wax, the brokenness of being a human being. That's what he took to the cross. And it says he carried our sorrows. So why are you carrying your sorrows when you can cast them on him? He says, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. He experienced complete isolation and complete abandonment. Even his heavenly Father, that he'd lived in unbroken union and communication with from all of eternity, it seemed like the Father turned his face away. He who knew no sin, another verse, this is 2 Corinthians 5, became sin for us. He knew the guilt and shame, and he knows how they feel, because that's what he bore on the cross. So if you ever wonder if Jesus understands what you feel like today, he understands all that and more, because he bore all of it for the entire human race at the same time. And it broke his heart. It crushed him. He did not die the way a crucifixion usually progresses. He died of that broken heart hours earlier than would have been projected, because his heart broke under the weight of our sin. Okay, so this is amazing, because I think my last pages are gone. They are. It's just not there. Well, so you got it, exactly. And I think what I was going to say is the moral to the story, what we all need to do with this story is just to come. Come as you are. Come exactly as you are. And just say, I need help. Amen. And he will help you. All right. Let's sing together.